Hey everyone, welcome to You Said What, where we look at the most memorable conversations and written interchanges in our lives. First off, I want to thank our sponsor, Pioneering Collective, an executive thought leadership firm combining personal PR, coaching to transform hard-earned wisdom into heavyweight impact. You can learn more at pioneeringcollective.com. Today's guest is Adam Najberg. Adam was a foreign correspondent for more than 20 years, and he's gone on now to work for some of the biggest Chinese tech companies in the world, brands like the drone brand DJI, the marketplace Alibaba, gaming company Tencent. On today's show, he's going to talk about a mentor who gave him a pep talk that led him to actually go to China in his early 20s, even though it wasn't the financially most responsible thing to do. We're also going to talk about what it's like to work for a major Chinese company at a time when the US and China seem to be constantly feuding. Hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Adam.
Hey, Ernie. Long time no see, no speak. I don't know what you say over this.
I know it has been a really long time. It's funny because I feel like I've known you for years, but seen very little of you. So it's good to actually, as you say, I don't know whether to see you, listen to you. I don't know how to express it, but it's great to be in the same company. You have a great background, and I want to get into that. Several decades in the media business and living in Greater China for like 30 years. So you've seen all kinds of interesting things happen there. Super interesting communications experience. So I want to get to that, but let's just start with your communications moment. Tell me about it.
Right.
Set the scene for me.
I totally will. Just think about a lot of instant ramen and a lot of those generic cigarettes, because that's kind of what I was able to afford at that time. It was about 30 years ago when I was a kid. I was sharing a house with this batty old artist lady and her flea-bitten cat that gave us all fleas, and sharing with another graduate student, another Wall Street Journal guy, actually. We both became Wall Street Journal guys later. Yeah, so we're living in this house, studying at Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and lusting after jobs as foreign correspondents in Asia. And, to get those, it was a 2-year program. To get those, you needed really prestigious summer internships and all that stuff. And I didn't really get great internships. I kind of hooked on wherever I could. I got lucky. I knew somebody who felt pity for me and gave me an internship at the Associated Press for summer. I worked night shifts there, but I was just grateful to get the clips and grateful to, mostly doing rewrites, but it was still fun. And I covered things like the 101 California shooting. I got some of the Unabomber coverage at the time. So that, I'm dating myself here, but
it all sounds very comfortable to me. I lived in that era, but also, as we'll talk about more, I realized I was listening to your story. There's so many parallels between yours and mine, which we'll talk about, but continue.
Yeah, sure. So I was running out of money. I had run out of teaching fellowships. I was also studying Asian studies at Berkeley, and I was working with a sociologist hero of mine named Tom Gold. And basically, I ran out of assistantships and money, and I needed to get a job. So I signed up for a semester to write my thesis, which I never finished because I was so busy looking for a job every day. I set up some strings here and there, and it was, barely making a living, barely able to pay my rent. And I really wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I had no idea how this was going to happen. I saw no future. I couldn't even get newspapers in Iowa to hire me to cover the stupid flower festival and stuff like that. So one day I'm at the journalism school, and there's this kid there, and I was introduced to him by the assistant dean, who said he worked for Orville Schell, who was a god to me. And I told him what an admirer I was of Orville. Now, Orville, he was in China pretty much before it was opened by Nixon and Kissinger. He went and worked in a commune. He wrote a book about it. That was my first exposure to China, really, I have to say. And I was just floored. This guy is writing journalistic style. He's writing in Rolling Stone magazine. It turns into a book. I want to be this guy when I grow up. So there's immediate hero worship. And over the years, Orville's very hard to define. He's a little bit like Hannah Arendt. What is he? He's not quite a journalist, not quite a sociologist, not quite a human rights guy. But basically what he would do is he would sort of go over to China every few years and capture the zeitgeist and come back and write a great article for The Atlantic or for Rolling Stone. And that would be the hook to get a book contract. He wrote amazing books like Disco's Democracy, The Gate of Heavenly Peace. So you kind of could read the eras of how China was modernizing and changing through his written work. And that's what I wanted to be. So this kid I met at the school, he said, oh, you like Orville? I'm like, oh, yeah, you should meet him. And I said, well, there's stuff going on. I don't know if I'm going to be able to. I am running out of money. I may have to move back home with my parents. but I'd love to talk to him. So lo and behold, a few days later, my phone rings at home, actually. And what I got was, hello, this is Orville Schell. I understand you're looking to speak with me. And I said, yeah. And he's like, what's going on? And I explained myself to him. I said, I really, really want to be in Asia. I want to be in China. I want to be a foreign correspondent. And he listened to the whole thing for about 10 minutes, kind of like you are right now. And he said to me, what's the problem? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you want to go, just go. Now, the thing was, like, it's such a simple, easy thing to say, right? And when I say it now, it's so obvious. And the thing was, like, I knew a fair bit about Orville. Like, it doesn't get much more white bread than Orville. He comes from the establishment. He's got 3 names, Yale. His dad went to Harvard. His dad was a very famous lawyer. And, Orville ran an organic farm, and he was a Vietnam War protester. And I was kind of like, at first, it's easy for him to say, but then I thought about it. He just said to me, here's the thing. The older you get, the more pressure there's going to be on you, the more funnels people try to shove you into, mortgages, kids, go take this job, which leads to that job, which leads to that job. And, I was weighing an offer at that point. I had been working the previous year on summer relief, vacation relief for the AP, as I mentioned. The AP didn't offer me a union job or full-time job with benefits. They offered me 3 part-time jobs. So I was kind of chewing on that at the same time that I was dealing with an old Mazda RX-7 that my brother-in-law had sold to me, where nothing in it worked anymore. All the electronics were dying. So when I went across the Bay Bridge, I had to open the door to pay the toll. They were basically telling me I had to move this hunk of junk across the country for 3 months at a pop, 3 months in Nebraska, 3 months in Ohio, 3 months in Iowa for legislative relief jobs. And then maybe I could get sent to a desk in New York, work there for 5 or 6 years, be a good boy. And maybe they'd send me to Prague or some other city, but no, China was not guaranteed. Whereas Orville is just telling me, if you want to go to China, just figure out how to get to China.
Let me ask you, so as you said, it sounds so simple. He says, if you want to go to China, go to China. But why hadn't you just gone to China? What was in your mind the biggest obstacle to just getting on a plane and going?
Yeah, so I had been in China for the first time in 1988 and 89, and I didn't really have a great relationship with the Chinese government at the time. They wouldn't renew my visa because even though I was on a student visa, I had sort of stopped going to class and started working for the Washington Post correspondent in Beijing when student protests broke out in 1989. For me, it was like a big break. This is when I knew, I wasn't going to play shortstop for the Yankees. I wasn't going to the New York Philharmonic, but damn, I was going to be a foreign correspondent. I love this stuff and I'm doing it. I just need a job. The problem was that I was not particularly welcome in China, and it was very hard as well, like to get there and live there, to be legit as a correspondent, you needed a news organization to sponsor you. And of course, none of them are going to take chances on you. You had some real giants there. You had Jim McGregor was there, Jay Matthews and Dan Sutherland were there, Uli Schmetzer, like all these big names of guys I wanted to be when I grew up.
There's kind of a catch-22. It's like you can't get sponsored by them unless you've done something, but you can't do something unless you get sponsored.
Yeah, and I split the difference. Orville's words turned a light bulb on in my mind, which was, don't let people tell you what to do. Don't let people define you. Don't let them decide your career path. Just take charge of it yourself. And, I wish I could say that it was all amazingly smooth. I mean, I ended up maxing out my credit card on top of my student debts. And, it was like 35 grand in the hole. Headed to Taiwan and slept on a friend's couch and worked overnight at a radio station. Did some produced pieces. Back then, we still used grease pencils and razor blades with 1/4-inch tape. I learned that at journalism school. This is before the MP3. But because I could do that, I did pieces for National Public Radio's Marketplace show. It took me about 8 months there before I got a job offer from Dow Jones in Hong Kong. And when I got that offer, apart from it being 3 times the amount that I was making in Taiwan, working overnight, it was a day job in Hong Kong, not overnight. It was like a full-time job with benefits, with a visa. I'd be based out of Hong Kong. I'd get trips into China. And I didn't even hesitate. Like Orville's.
So you were set now.
Yes, yeah. Well,
you were on your way.
Yeah, I mean, at least on my way. And the thing was, I had fundamentally changed because those words from Orville, I don't even think he knows. Like, I haven't really told him this, but I think he affected me in a way that nobody else has professionally, because he just said, cut through this nonsense, do what you want to do. Don't just follow the rules, be who you want to be. And I'm doing that today. I mean, I didn't know how to write a novel. I just did it. I didn't know how to do a documentary. I've done 4 of them. I'm finishing one up right now. You just make it up as you go along.
Yeah. So he partly gave you courage to just do stuff and not worry so much about how it was going to happen or the result. But you also had some pretty real financial concerns. You were trying to balance the practicality of going $35,000 in debt versus is it going to pay off in the end and I'm going to make more money and it won't worry me down the road? Like it wasn't just fear of going to a new country and meeting new people as some people might have. There was like some real more practical issues of, is this going to work out? Am I going to wind up on the street, right?
Fear is a great motivator, Ernie. I have to say, and also when you're young, you don't know any better. I'd be lying to you if I told you that it was a smooth ride. I mean, I had some really sick, disgusting, terrible jobs in Taiwan. Even when I first moved to Hong Kong to supplement income, there were some things I needed to do that I wouldn't have otherwise done. When you have money, you have choices. But, don't get me wrong, I wasn't a drug dealer or anything like that, but it was, I guess, those are the things I chalk up to building character. I worked in a supermarket for a bunch of years because I needed to make money. I don't come from money, but so you do what you have to do to make it work. But yeah, I felt like the light bulb came on because, my parents were always trying to tell me like, yeah, it's okay to dream, but you also have to have a plan. And Orville was like, make the plan up, just go. And you know what? Like God always provides. I don't know. Maybe that sounds banal, but it just always sort of worked out in the end. It wasn't smooth or easy, but it just happened.
What did your parents say? What was their take on whether you should go or stay, or did they have a perspective?
Well, I mean, my father was the first person in his family to go to college, came from Polish immigrants. They were barely literate. My grandfather read the Bible and could read the Yiddish newspapers, and my grandmother couldn't read or write. So they wanted him to be a teacher, and he ended up being a social worker. And he made a good living, being a social worker. He always had a job all the way through, but we didn't have a lot of money. And he thought I was crazy for just picking up and going halfway across the world, eating with chopsticks. He never left the country. It was crazy. And my mother was like an adventurer. She had been all over the world when her father died when she was quite young. Her mother took her on a world tour. They didn't have great money, but they were fine. And, I think for her, like she was living vicariously through me, but I think she was like scared, really, really scared for me because, back then you couldn't just, have a conversation like you and I are having for free over the internet. There was nothing like that. And, we had a very tight relationship. And while intellectually she thought it was great for me, I just think she wondered if I was really going to make it because I was kind of, she thought, quiet, naive, introverted, maybe a little bit too low key.
That's interesting. And then over the years, as it obviously sort of worked out for you, did you have more conversations about that? Did they say, it's great you did that? Or was there ever anything of like, we were always a little averse to taking chances, but it's great you did? Or was there any ever full-throated conversation about what you did?
I think they were really proud of me, because when you end up working at the Wall Street Journal, it is like playing for the Yankees or the New York Philharmonic. Like it doesn't get much better than that in a career. I mean, there are a few places that are equal to that. So I think they were impressed and they, very Jewish parents. To my face, they would never say anything really, nice or flattering to me. But I would hear through the Jewish mafia, that, with all the cousins and nieces and nephews and stuff. Oh, your mother was telling me you're a big star at the Wall Street Journal. It's like, actually, I'm kind of the utility infielder there, but whatever. I cover markets.
You weren't a doctor or lawyer, but at least you worked for the Wall Street Journal.
Exactly, right?
Well, it was funny reading a little bit about your story because you were in this JET program, which I was into after college, where you worked for the Japanese government teaching English in schools. And that was such a great kind of entree into Asia and pretty well paid, by the way, too. But I did the way you said, I'm not going to do these series of gigs at the AP and bide my time to get overseas. I did that. I actually worked in New York on the international desk, editing all those stories from correspondents that I wanted to be and working these unbelievably crazy hours overnights and not evenings. And I did it for as long as I could for a couple of years. And then I just said, a little bit like you, I said, I'm just going to go to Hong Kong. I took a job at the Asian Wall Street Journal, but I had some real parallels to your track. It's interesting how people just, they have a dream and figure out how to get there.
Yeah. And that was sort of the thing that I was worried about at the time, because it wasn't until years later when I was looking at getting out of journalism. And I said to myself, I need to talk to some people to understand how to present myself. Because when you present yourself as a journalist, it's very in your face, it's aggressive, it's, very Columbo-esque, even if you're low key. Oh, mind if I ask you another question? That kind of thing. It doesn't play very well when you're trying to get a job in the world of business or something like that. So what I realized was this was very crystallized for me. This one great headhunter in New York said to me, she said, the problem with your CV is you look like a doer, not an achiever. She said, you wrote for the Journal for how many years? She's like, tell a story about yourself. Every line on your CV should have a story attached to it. When I see your CV, those are the breadcrumbs. Tantalize me, intrigue me with your wordsmithery. And then, when you get into the interview, you know what questions we're going to ask you. And she said, you just need to be really practice it, telling that story like it's the first time you ever told it and get the same laugh that you did, have the same passion. I mean, the good thing about me is I don't have to fake the passion. I really love what I do or I wouldn't do it.
You did transition into the business world. You had a distinguished foreign correspondent career for 25 years all around the world. And then you decided to leave media. Talk about that transition.
Decided to leave media is a good way of putting it. Like I got rid of my own student debt, and then I had my own 2 kids who were getting ready to go to university. And I just got it in my head. It was the same thing. I said, like, what's the best gift that I could give them? And the best gift that I could give them is to give them like 4 years of education with no debt. So the journal treated me great. I had a really good run there. I don't think I burnt any bridges when I left. I don't know if you heard of anybody saying bad things about me, but in the hallways.
I did my due diligence. I asked around before, but I couldn't find anything.
But making that transition for me was largely about the money. But then what was interesting to me is like, I can't do something that I don't like to do. So what I found was, being a new kind of PR person was really helpful to me. Using content to tell stories, not press releases, speaking to journalists, not hiding from them. And, it was Chinese tech companies that gave me the opportunity to do this. I'm working for my 3rd one right now. It's just a great, interesting experience. It's like very different from working at the journal, very different from working at the supermarket or just a quote unquote normal company.
Talk about that because I'm really curious about it. So what is the big difference between, you've worked for 3 massive Chinese tech companies, and what is the difference between working for let's just make a parallel, a big Chinese tech company and a big American tech company?
From the American tech company side, I just know what I covered, and for friends, from friends who worked at them, those are jobs at American tech companies where, it's kind of like working for the Wall Street Journal, but in the business world, you work for Facebook, now Meta, Google, you get big projects. They want to change the world. I think, for Chinese companies, like I worked at DJI, Shenzhen DJI, they make consumer drones. They have about a 70-80% market share. If you ask them, yeah, we want to change the world with technology, but they also really want to make money. They're very focused, even though they'll talk about long-term, they're very focused on short-term because China is hyper competitive. And if you can't be first or second in China, there really is nothing after second place. You're basically sitting around waiting to fold or be eaten if you're 3rd or 4th place. And I think that is very different from American companies that, even if they're not the largest in their sector, they find a reason to be, they find a niche for themselves, or they become really experts at one part of the market. But for Chinese companies, it's all about winning. They say in China, it's not just business, it's always personal too. So they take things very personally at a place like DJI. Anytime a rival would come out with something, they would investigate it to make sure that they weren't faking something, things like that. And then I worked at Alibaba, which was gigantic. Alibaba is just like
right.
Everybody thinks it's China's Amazon, but it's so much more. And I have to say, someone like Jack Ma was quite inspiring. He basically...
The founder of Alibaba.
Yeah, founder of Alibaba.
Right.
What's so impressive about large Chinese tech companies, just to put this into perspective, is that when they started in the late 1990s, primarily, they either didn't have or couldn't afford the things that you needed. They were years behind the United States. But, if you need things like servers, if you need things like cybersecurity or payment services or things like that, they just didn't have or couldn't afford them. So they ended up bootstrapping and making all this stuff themselves. Now, yeah, okay, there was some help from the government. The markets weren't necessarily that open in China. But I have to say, like, what is impressing me about these companies is how they have managed to just build it all themselves and create it all themselves and then just become juggernauts at what they're doing. So they're kind of sprawling across different sectors. I mean, I had no idea until I went to work at Alibaba. They do cloud computing, they do supermarket and food delivery. They have branded platforms for e-commerce. They have kind of small vendors who sell on another platform. It's pretty amazing. Everything in China is bigger, Ernie. That's what I could say. Everything in China is bigger and it moves faster.
How does that hyper competitiveness that you just talked about, how does that change what someone, if you're running comms for them, how does that change your job? Does it mean your projects day to day are different? Does it just mean that you feel like part of a team that's all kind of rowing in the same direction? Like, how does that change the kinds of stuff you'd be working on as opposed to if you worked for Facebook?
Just let me use DJI as an example because I think they brought me in there to create the global PR function. they didn't really have anything like that. So, for me, it was a grand adventure. I had to kind of go find the right people to achieve the goals that we needed. In Europe, there was a lot of regulatory related issues with data privacy that we needed to deal with for DJI. In North America, which is where we had one of our largest markets, or actually was the largest market at the time. I don't know if it still is, but what you wanted there was you wanted to make sure that you had quite strong connections with dealers in New York, B&H Photo and Adorama, the other vendors who would move your product, because DJI didn't really have its own stores. Everything was a challenge. I dealt outside of China. So I was like ex-China, so to speak. I had colleagues who did only stuff inside China. And for me, it was just, I don't know, it was a fascinating ride. And we're making it up as we went along. None of them had any experience in the United States. I had very little experience in PR. What I decided was, since they had a lot of money, I hired people who were better and smarter than I was. I wanted to have that same kind of killer instinct that they did to win, be first, be best. And we created a lot of things at DJI that I ended up modeling over at Alibaba as well. So I feel like it's been an experience that I could transport between and among Chinese companies that I've worked for.
So when you were talking to all these small vendors in the US, fruit sellers and others, were they also on Amazon? Were you competing with Amazon to try to win their business? How did that work?
A different market. I mean, Amazon really doesn't exist in China. They don't have a native site in China. I think the country lost that battle. In the United States, it's just different models. I mean, what Alibaba was about, especially for Taobao and Tmall, was about bringing vendors, small brands and larger, more well-known brands into China, because those platforms are domestic. And to be honest, one of the reasons I didn't take the whole tension thing so seriously is if you get enough of your, your vendor in the United States, you're getting enough of your business shipping to China that you didn't have before, you need to hire more people. Your business gets bigger. It's opening a new market by removing a lot of the risk.
This was additive business for
Yeah. I don't think it was really, we're competing with Amazon. I think, people would compare us to Amazon, and superficially at an e-commerce level, there were some similarities there. We both sell things, but the model is also just very, very different.
You've lived overseas for a long time now, around the world when you were a foreign correspondent, and then in Greater China for, I think, 25, 30 years. Is that right? Maybe I have the wrong number. How long have you lived in either in China, Hong Kong, or Singapore?
Like total of 20 something years. And I was in Europe for 7 years as well.
So how has your view of the US changed as you've been away from it for longer?
It's so funny. I was just discussing this at dinner with another old colleague of ours, Jonathan Freeland. I lived with a guy in Taiwan. We shared a flat, but neither of us had any money at the time. And we met up here in Singapore where he lives, and we were discussing this, and the same thing came up. We left America in about 1990 when we got out of college, and sort of never really went back, even though we'd go back on visits or might live there for a couple of years or work there for a couple of years. Our vision of America is frozen in 1990 when Republicans and Democrats still talked to each other, when American infrastructure wasn't crumbling, where we still had Roe versus Wade. Sorry, I don't mean to turn this political, but it's just, I guess what I'm saying is that I remember a sort of gentler America. We were less in a state of Reaganomics decay. And you still didn't have that huge a yawning gap between rich and poor. The middle class was still something you could hold on to. And the reason I say this is because I've lived all over the world. And what I see is, like, these days, it's way better to be German middle class than it is to be American middle class. And likewise, in China, the middle class is just, it's doubling every couple of years. And lifestyle is just, I feel like America has become almost more existential in a lot of ways. There's not as much quality of life. So that's kind of how I view America is, it's not the place I remember. It's a lot meaner and shabbier.
So you're not one of these people that's, I'd love to get back. I'm sad. I miss it. You're nostalgic for those better days, but you don't every year have this conversation where you're with your wife where you're like, should we go back?
Well, my wife is German, so she wants to go back to Germany, and I'm fine. I'm fine
so
with
you have
that.
a different conversation.
Yeah, no, but I think, but she has the same sort of fond memories of the older America. It wasn't quite 1990 for her. I only met her a few years later, but it's like, we remember that being a really nice place to visit, and family, and good shopping that was cheap, and decent food, and some things just happened. I don't know. I love America. I think the concept of America is fantastic. I just think that people are sort of unhealthy, unhappy. And I'm like, what did you do to my country?
What about living in places like, I lived in Hong Kong for 4 years. What about living in places like Hong Kong and Singapore versus living in China proper? Would you move to China proper? Would you live there for the rest of your life?
No,
do you see it?
No.
Why not?
Well, right now, just because COVID zero is still going on, and that's tough. Even Chinese friends are saying it's hard to get in and out. But more generally, I don't know. Hong Kong feels most like hope to me because, one kid was born there. The other was conceived there. Sorry, too much information, but that's where I prospered. My family prospered. That's where the kids grew up and went to school. I don't know. It's just a very good, exciting, interesting, fast moving place. Singapore, I like a lot. It's just so damn hot here. I wish every day it's like, 95 degrees. It's like Florida, but the food is better than Florida. That's one thing I have to say. I love the food here in Singapore.
Food is amazing. I'm jealous of you. Yeah.
The hawker stalls all the way up to 3-star Michelin stuff. I mean, at my age, when I say it's boring to live here, that's a good thing, actually. It's safe, it's clean. It's kind of like the Disney version of Asia. And I quite like it at this stage of life. You don't walk out in the street and worry about people pulling a gun on you or carjacking you. Crime happens everywhere. Bad things happen everywhere. But I don't know. I'm enjoying life, quality of life outside of the United States right now. My issue with living in China is I like my satellite TV, or my channels. I like the food that I like. So wherever I go, I kind of create that little cubby hole for myself. And it's harder to do in China because if you don't quote unquote go native, which you do most of the time, but it's still not geared towards big nose foreigner guy like me, nor should it be.
I can empathize with the big nose foreigner part of it. I'm one of those guys too. You're now firmly in the communications world. If the media world isn't different thing than communications, or course, just say corporate communications, I'm also in the communications world now. We work at Pioneer Collective, work with executives on their building their brand and they're amplifying their brand. What's the communication skill for you over the years that has come in most handy? Like, when people talk about communication skills, they list 5, 10 different things and everybody has their own list of what are the most important things. And this can either be from the media chapter or from your corporate communications chapter, but what's the communication skills that you feel like you rely on most frequently?
The way it works for me mostly is you try to be, when you're a journalist, you try to be empathic. You kind of want to understand what the person's feeling, what their angle is. It helps you figure out how to get information from them. But I think that has served me quite well on the communication side. I rely a lot on reading people and figuring out the best way to get the kind of response or action that I want. You can't control other people, but in journalism, you kind of learn to control the situation as best you can to get what you needed to be an effective communicator, right? The other thing is...
Are you talking about listening?
It's not so much listening as reading, kind of deciding what the best approach is at dealing with people. The best bosses that I ever had in journalism would treat me differently than they would treat you because they knew you were motivated by different things. So I try to be that way as well as a communicator. And it's good because a lot of communications people approach things with just the one set of rules. We do a press release at this time, and you do need discipline and organization and infrastructure, but I also think that it's a people business. And if you could read the people best and make things quite personal with them and connect with them, it's a lot easier for them. And I talk about media, or especially when you're dealing with media or others who you need to do something for you, help you with something, just be able to find the best approach to that. The second thing is somewhat related. We're really good, we journalists, at distilling information quickly. So I can kind of hear something and think about it, take some notes. And 20 minutes later, I can sort of give you, in journalism, I used to give you a market story. Now what I do is I give the boss a set of bullet points, some action points based on what I just heard. I noticed that others who don't necessarily come from the same background. Some people have the skill, but generally the average person, takes longer to be able to figure that out. It's quite a task. They can't distill and present in an organized fashion at any high speed like we can.
So you're talking about being somewhat analytical because you're being able to sort of distill things, but then also package them tightly. Self-editing.
Yeah, that's right. And also very quickly learning about something. Because most of the time, when you went to cover bagels, Barry Newman doing a story about bagel-related injuries, he didn't know anything about bagels except that he liked to eat them, but he became an expert when he was doing it. And I kind of, I always think that way. Like whenever I find something new, how is my current job, how is a video game developed? What's the process for it? Or in Alibaba, how does that cold chain work to get those cherries over from Washington State to the consumer in the Chinese grocery store? That was part of the fun of being a journalist. And I think applying it to PR makes it more fun too.
What about when you work with executives? Are there pieces of advice that you find yourself repeating over and over again? What's your mantra when you work with leaders?
So, I mean, I've worked mostly with Chinese leaders, and I think the one thing that is sort of uniform is they always ask me, how should I behave? Or what should I be saying? Or what should I be projecting? What I say to them all the time is, be yourself. This is a power relationship. When you are talking to the media, they want information from you. You can be as you are. But I think they're a little bit nervous or tentative sometimes if English is not their first language at how they should present themselves. Now, there are exceptions to every rule. I think Jack Ma was an exception to that. Jack Ma was just Jack Ma all the time. His vice chairman, Joe Tsai, one of the reasons I joined Alibaba was I just found him a very inspirational guy. He is exactly how he is with everybody. He doesn't change one whit, and you got to respect that about him. DJI had younger CEO, founder, chairman. He really wanted you to kind of coach him to get rid of the rough edges. And what I find myself saying is, let your real self come out. And that is not something that is really that taught in China, I think. People I know, unless they're very good friends, in which case they're very, very direct. But most people are reserved in China, and they kind of hold a little bit back and check out the situation first.
Just back to the question about the tension, but not to dwell on the tension between the US and China, but it exists and it's obviously very real. Do you get caught up in that at all, either with your work relationships or your friend relationships, like, working for Chinese companies, basically living in that part of the world for so long? Do people lump you together with that, whatever that means? Do you find yourself having to explain yourself or what's going on to people a lot? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying. Well, I mean, if people think something, they certainly don't say it to my face, which is probably okay because I punch them in the nose. No, seriously. In general, though, I would say, I think they know the score. Most of my friends are former journalists or current journalists, and they know I need to make a living, and they know that who I work for, and I have my true north, and I've been able to keep my true north working at Chinese companies. I think they think differently. All this stuff that I read gets on my nerves because it's kind of like the media reporting on the war between Russia and Ukraine about all the heroic Ukrainians. And it's true, there are. But then the media twists itself into pretzel to try to explain how the Russians are, overwhelming cities in Ukraine. And the point I'm trying to make is that I feel like a lot of what you read is only part of the story. And I think that I feel that way about working at Chinese companies. Some of the best friends and relationships I have been made over the last 7 years with people I work with. These are human beings. And I don't think there's anything inherently evil about an American corporation or a Chinese corporation.
Adam, thanks so much. Great to see you. We probably saw more of each other today than we have in a number of years, but it's fantastic to get a chance to talk to you again. And thanks for making time to come on the show.
Don't be a stranger. Come out. We'll have some noodles together, man.
I can't wait. Thanks again. Talking with Adam reminded me that sitting in the US, we definitely read part of the story about China, but it's through the lens of how we view the world. And of course, there's another side of the story that you get from people who live there and who work there. People always say there's two sides to every story. And my conversation with Adam was clear that that's true. It was also interesting to talk to him about the fact that, as he said, Chinese leaders are kind of seeking the same thing that American business executives are seeking. They want to be more authentic. I guess that's one way in which we're all the same. If you've got a great communications experience that had a big impact on you, email me. I'd love to feature you on the show. And if you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe to You Said What. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.